Hey everyone, this is a piece by Victor Serge titled, Did the USSR Have a Socialist Regime? It's from June 1947. I'm getting this from Marxist.org's German section, and I'm using Google Translate to translate the page. So that means it might not be perfect, but the hopefully and this might have there might actually be an English translation of this. I do not know, but we'll see. Hopefully this is a decent enough reading. I mean, a decent enough translation. I usually find the translations to be pretty okay. Anyway, 20th century science achieved such great victories, both practical and theoretical, that it believed it had largely solved the, quote, riddles of nature. This was true, however, only to a certain extent, ... If contemporary man has gained one insight from the scientific conquests of the past half-century, it is above all that reality is infinitely more complex and dynamic than it appeared in the times of Spencer, Fontana, Helmholtz, Karl Marx, and Kropotkin. All that remains of the naive atomistic view of the last century is a scheme despised even by elementary school students. Nuclear physics puts forward dizzying hypotheses about the structure of the universe that are barely comprehensible to the average person. Since Charcot and Wundt, modern psychology has made such progress in analyzing the human psyche that previous views have become untenable in several important respects, particularly with regard to the explanation of religiosity generally accepted by the materialists of the last century. The same applies to sociologists. These observations, however, should not confuse us. Rather, they should strengthen our faith in the infinite possibilities of the human mind and the usefulness of scientific methods. Our confusion in the face of the complexity of our world stems primarily from our inability to utilize the vast number of recently acquired discoveries and from our fixation on syntheses that were previously accurate but are now inadequate and outdated. Scientific socialism, whose principle is to be guided primarily by exact knowledge, was based until after the Russian Revolution on the conception that the only possible alternatives were capitalism or socialism, reaction or revolution. This conception was correct in practice, easy to develop, and contained and still contains a kernel of proven truth. Socialism meant the socialization of the means of production, and all our parties demanded in their programs to this end, quote, the abolition of private ownership of the means of production, end quote. This seemed to be the first condition for the establishment of a rational social system based on the principle of law. Socialism cannot in any way be accused of not having foreseen everything. On the contrary, Marxists know how deeply human thinking is conditioned and constrained by its era. What is astonishing is rather the extent to which socialism was able to predict historical developments and how much its claims and aspirations still hold true today. But his intellectual resources have weakened. I guess socialism's intellectual resources have weakened at the very moment when most of its demands have been and are being put on the agenda as a result of events. The theory of, quote, capitalism or socialism, end quote, suffered from schematicism and a lack of imagination. Its perspective was limited to the very concrete present. I do not deny that Marx, Kautsky, Bogdanov, Rosa Luxemburg, and Trotsky occasionally transcended these boundaries, that they had truly brilliant ideas, but they lacked the time to develop them in depth. Moreover, these theoretical insights were known only to a few scholars, for they were not integrated into the thinking of the socialist movement at the time. Then, third solutions gradually prevailed. Neither capitalism nor socialism, but several forms of social organization, which we experience as a general phenomenon and which can be defined as a bureaucratic planned economy based on the devaluation, reduction, or abolition of private property. Several remarkable works on the Nazi economy have been published in the United States. I will mention only one here, namely that of Franz Neumann, of the Frankfurt School, Behemoth, Structure and Practice of National Socialism, published in 1942. This is an analysis of an economy that was rigorously collectivized with the help of state monopolies, which in turn were subject to a terrorist, belligerent police organization. Private property ceased to be a reality and became its ridiculously respected symbol. It lost all initiative and retained only ever-diminishing profits, which were strictly controlled. But since the regime had been established with the help of big business and most capitalist families had joined the party, the old forms outwardly survived. However, privileges were no longer based in reality on ownership of the means of production or money, but on participation in political power, and this participation guaranteed the individual only a minimum of security, which was constantly in question. The similarities between this economic system and that of the USSR were so striking that American observers such as President Roosevelt and the ambassador to Moscow, Joseph E. Davies, described both regimes as totalitarian. Better informed authors such as James Burnham, Dwight MacDonald, and Sidney Hook reached the same conclusion. Trotsky had already written earlier, I believe, in August 1939, quote, "All these regimes, USSR, fascism, Nazism, New Deal, obviously have common features which are ultimately determined by the collectivist tendency of modern economics," end quote. Trotsky. New section. Collectivism or socialism? Modern history is determined by a tremendous new reality. The technological progress of industrial society inevitably leads to economic planning and thus to the abolition of laissez-faire, to the restriction and practical abolition of the rights of free enterprise, to the abolition of the free market through state control at the national and international level, in short, to collectivism. But it has been shown that economic collectivism, which I, 20 years old, like most revolutionaries at that time, considered synonymous with, quote, socialism, by no means excludes the harshest exploitation of man by man, privileges on the one hand and servitude on the other, oppression and war. It has been shown that various forms of collectivism can be realized by socialist revolution, as was the case from 1917 to about 1927 in Russia, with three successive economic systems: council democracy, war communism, new economic policy, by a counter-revolution burgeoning within the socialist revolution, Russia from 1927 onwards, Stalinist totalitarianism of our time, by an anti-socialist counter-revolution, Nazi Germany, and by democratic systems that exclude revolution and counter-revolution and are, as a whole, rather conservative. By this I mean the war economy of the USA, which is to a large extent a planned economy and whose results in terms of production and the maintenance of a high standard of living were astonishing. Collectivism, i.e. complete or more or less mixed socialization of production, is no longer synonymous with, quote, socialism. Socialist theory has always encompassed two aspects. On the one hand, economic knowledge leading to the realization of a rational economy, and on the other, human liberation and the realization of a human existence elevated to a new dignity. A rational economy is merely a means to improving human conditions. A collectivism that permanently impairs human living conditions is anti-socialist. How, then, should we assess the collectivism of the USSR? Let us first rule out verbal deceptions and theoretical fetishism. Words are misleading because they do not change, while reality changes. In the definition of social classes derived by Marx from the experiences of the 19th century, is the definition of social classes derived by Marx from the experiences of the 19th century sufficient to explain the social structure of the USSR? Allow me to leave this problem to the adherents of pure theory. There are several social groups in the USSR that are clearly distinct from one another and can be defined by their function in the state, their function in production, and their material and spiritual situation. Whether we should call them classes, castes, social strata, or something else seems secondary to me. Rather, our commitment to the scientific spirit of socialism obliges us to consider reality. New section. Modern slavery. Around 1936-37, the USSR began to emerge from the terrible famine that resulted from the forced collectivization of agriculture and the deportation of approximately 5 million peasant families, the majority of whom perished in the process. The best-informed authors at the time estimated that the privileged group of the Soviet population, whose living conditions were comparable to those of middle-class to wealthy Frenchmen at that time, could be estimated at 15%, while the material conditions, housing, food, clothing, of the remaining 85% were considerably worse than under the old regime and the revolutionary years of 1926 to 28. This 15% consisted of party cadres of agricultural and industrial production, intellectuals, army and police cadres, and their families. In other words, less than 7% of the entire adult population. In the years 1936 to 38, Stalin's bloody purges brought economic progress to a standstill. Since 1939, the preparation for the imminent war had the same effect. Rationing was reintroduced. Then came the devastation of war. The percentage of the Soviet population that could eat their fill and sleep in a proper bed had certainly decreased. Let's still stick with 7% of adults, or 15% including children. We must now contrast this figure with another, one of extraordinary importance for anyone seeking to define the social structure of the USSR. 7%, or 15%, would not allow us to speak of a socialist regime. At most, of rudimentary socialist intentions and tendencies of Soviet collectivism. But what follows is terrible. According to the most competent estimates of numerous witnesses, reporters, and experts on the Russian problem, in 1941, approximately 9,500,000 people lived in the 38 large known concentration camps, and several million in the lesser-known camps of the USSR. These were generally adults who constituted a, quote, special labor reserve, end quote, namely convict workers to be precise. Their total number is estimated at 15 million adults. During the war, this population of convicts declined due to mobilization and increased mortality, which in turn resulted from increased deprivation. Since then, however, it has again reached or exceeded its previous level, which is due to the mass deportation of the Soviet population, sections described as defeatist, the deportation of inhabitants of the defeated or, quote, liberated countries, the renewed purges, and the imprisonment of returned Soviet prisoners of war and enemy prisoners of war. Obvious there is only insufficient and approximate information about these facts. Footnote. The state of information has, however, changed to this day. In the wake of de-Stalinization announced at the 20th Party Congress of the CPSU, a wealth of memoirs and first-hand accounts of the penal camps are now available. However, a scientific materialist analysis of the penal camp system and terror as a component of terrorist capitalist accumulation is still lacking. The most comprehensive Soviet oppositional attempt to date, Roy Medvedev's The Truth is Our Strength, published in Germany in 1972, for all its merits, still suffers too much from the 40-year deformation of Marxism in the Soviet Union. See Solzhenitsyn, Gulag 1 and 2. A more comprehensive, both methodological and descriptive approach is provided by Rita DeLeo in her study The Workers in the Soviet System, published in Germany in 1972. I believe Rita DeLeo was a part of like Italian Apparismo. I'm not sure though, but I believe that is the case. Anyway, end footnote. The fact is that the social hierarchy of the USSR includes a huge number of imprisoned, enslaved, and hyper-exploited workers, which is constantly decreasing and increasing, and according to several average figures, amounts to 15% of adults. So 7% privileged adults, 15% disenfranchised, 72% exploited living in hardship and poverty. I fear these figures are still optimistic, but even if they were somewhat exaggerated, if only 8 to 10% of adult workers lived in concentration camps, that would not change the significance of this fact. Mere common sense shows that a regime that maintains a labor reserve of convicts and slaves cannot in any way be called socialist or even remotely socialist. New section, the massacre of the, quote, old Bolsheviks. The question of the regime's historical origins becomes secondary from now on. It is only important to remember in this regard that Soviet totalitarianism was stabilized between 1936 and 1938 through a bloody act of violence against the generation of revolutionaries and members of the party of Lenin and Trotsky. Let us try to determine its extent. That is, roughly the number of victims of, quote, Soviet Thermidor. In his speech of March 3, 1937, Stalin gave the following figures regarding the party cadres: 3,000 to 4,000 senior officials, 30,000 to 40,000 middle officials, 100,000 to 150,000 junior officials. This amounts to a total of approximately 200,000 bureaucrats. Joseph E. Davies wrote in Mission to Moscow that by May of 1936, and that was just the beginning, the purges had affected between 56 and 62% of the party cadre, more than 100,000 functionaries to begin with. The governments of the federative and autonomous republics were shuffled 3 or 4 times before the war. John Scott, correspondent for the American press in the USSR, was living in Magnitogorsk at the time, and since he did not limit himself to observing the goings-on in the party alone, he wrote, quote, "The purges had disastrous consequences for several million Soviet citizens who were arrested and exiled. The majority were innocent, but some were guilty, ... end quote." John Scott. These facts highlight the sharp rift between the rudimentarily socialist regime that emerged from the revolution and the totalitarian regime that succeeded it with the blood of revolutionaries and the sweat of pariahs. The legal and spiritual condition of man has always been essential for socialists. It can only be defined by the degree of legal security, the freedom of the citizen, and the type of control citizens exercise over the state, democratic institutions. It would be almost ridiculous to examine this terrible question. A vast majority of those convicted in the USSR were neither tried nor defended. Administrative commissions secretly determined their fate. About 100 old Bolsheviks were shot after one-off show trials or lies and deception. Thousands were executed without trial or after secret trials that could only be a sad farce of any form of justice. A regime in which the peasant, the worker, the technician, the high-ranking official, the minister, the marshal decorated with gold medals knows that he can disappear forever into the night cannot be called a socialist without ridiculing the very idea of socialism. There are precise old terms to describe such a regime: tyranny, despotism, and that new, even more precise term, totalitarianism. Need we remind you that we never have known how and why Politburo member Rudzatak, Marshal Blücher, Marshal Egorov, and writers Boris Pilniak and Osip Mandelstam and botanist Nicholas Vavilov disappeared. There's 2 footnotes here. Footnote 1. The great poet Osip Mandelstam, released after his arrest, was arrested again and died of typhus on his way to a concentration camp in the Far East in late 1941 or early 1942. Next footnote. Nicholas Vavilov was arrested in 1943 and died shortly thereafter under unknown circumstances. Vavilov, born in 1887 and a member of the Academy of Sciences, was one of the most famous Russian scholars. For a long time, he headed the Institute of Applied Botany and New Cultures. He was specifically tasked with researching and implementing the expansion of grain cultivation in the Arctic regions. No one will be surprised that he failed and fell victim to accusations of, quote, sabotage. End footnote. The experience of Stalinism proves that the abolition of private ownership of the means of production, collectivization, and planning can lead to the most inhuman anti-socialist, also in the economic sense of the word, if they permit the establishment of a terrorist economic machine that wields extreme power. The socialist movements demand the rational organization of production for the benefit of the community. A closer look at the totalitarian system reveals immediately how irrational its organization is, the excessive cost it generally incurs, how superficial and often anarchic its despotic planning is. If slavery and servitude were abolished in the 19th century, this was certainly not due to a sudden burst of generosity, although in the United States, Brazil, and Russia, the idealism of the reformers played a major role. Rather, it was due to the fact that relatively free wage labor instead of slave labor had become a condition of industrial progress. The experience of the United States shows that high wages increase labor productivity. Even in times of need, free criticism, free thought, and free initiative are an irreplaceable incentive for the producer. A workers' democracy had and would be able to accomplish a magnificent economic and social work in Russia. Pure hypothesis, you might reply. A hypothesis, certainly, but an easily demonstrable hypothesis. And don't forget that the task of reason is to transcend reality, and that sooner or later human beings must create a habitable world for themselves. That's the end of the piece. Thanks for listening.